Madrid, 1661. The royal palace was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the whispers of the ladies-in-waiting who moved like shadows through the corridors. Queen Mariana of Austria had been in labor for 12 hours. Her screams had long since faded, replaced by an exhaustion that alarmed the royal physicians. Philip IV, or King of Spain, and the last great monarch of the Habsburg dynasty, waited in his private chamber. At his age, his face bore the marks of time and responsibility. This would be his 7th child with Mariana, his niece and second wife, 26 years his junior. Of his previous children, only the Infanta Margarita Teresa had survived infancy. "Your Majesty," announced the Duke of Medina, entering the chamber. "With hesitant steps, the Queen has given birth to a boy." Philip IV stood immediately, but he noticed the Duke's face lacked the expected joy at the birth of a prince. And the child? "How is my son?" he asked, already dreading the answer. The Duke lowered his gaze. "He lives, Your Majesty, but the physicians say they have never seen anything like it." The king strode toward the door, brushing past the Duke. As he walked through the palace corridors, he noticed the servants averting their eyes or shrinking away. The silence was no longer one of anticipation, but of fear. Upon entering the royal chamber, he found Queen Mariana unconscious, surrounded by pale-faced midwives and physicians. In a nearby cradle, wrapped in the finest silk sheets, lay the newborn Don Luis de Haro. The chief royal physician bowed before the king. "Your Majesty, the prince lives," he said, his voice breaking, "but he presents severe deformities. His lower jaw is almost non-existent. He cannot nurse. His head is irregular in shape and size." Philip IV approached the cradle slowly. What he saw made his heart sink. The baby's jaw was so retracted that his lower lip nearly touched his nose. The back of his head was unusually flat, and his eyes seemed too far apart. His tiny limbs were weak and trembling. "Will he live?" the king asked, not taking his eyes off his son. "It is impossible to say, Your Majesty. I have never seen a child survive with such conditions. He cannot feed naturally. The wet nurses will have to give him milk drop by drop with extreme care to prevent choking." The king gazed at the child in silence. This would be his heir, Charles II of Spain, if he survived. The fate of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and its vast empire rested on this fragile being, struggling to breathe before him. "It is God's will," he murmured finally. "He was born a prince and will be treated as one. If God wills him to live, he will live." But deep down, Philip knew this was the result of generations of marriages between close relatives. The Habsburgs had consolidated their power through centuries of endogamous matrimonial alliances, uncles with nieces, cousins with cousins. "Let others wage war. You happy Austria marry" had been the family motto since time immemorial. That night, as news of the prince's birth spread through Madrid, Philip IV knelt in his private chapel. "My God," he whispered, "what have we done?" 4 years later. The young Prince Charles was 4 years old, though his physical and mental development resembled that of a 2-year-old. In the eastern wing of the Alcazar of Madrid, far from the prying eyes of the court, the heir to the Spanish throne lived in a carefully controlled world, crafted by his mother, the regent, Queen Mariana. Philip IV had died when Charles was barely 4, leaving his widow as regent of a declining empire. Queen Mariana, aware of her son's fragility and the political threats surrounding them, had built a protective bubble of female servants, physicians, and clerics around the prince. Doña Isabel de Montoya, the prince's chief caretaker, entered the royal chamber with a small tray. "Your Highness, it is time for your meal," she announced softly. Charles sat in a small chair adapted to his frail body. At 4, he had only just learned to walk, and his speech was limited and unclear, a direct consequence of his pronounced mandibular deformity. His oversized tongue, too large for his malformed mouth, made articulation difficult in feeding a challenge. Isabel knelt before the prince and began the laborious process of feeding him with a small silver spoon, carefully introducing tiny amounts of chicken broth mixed with beaten egg, ensuring he did not choke. Despite his age, Charles still could not chew solid food. All his meals had to be liquid or semi-liquid. As she fed him, Isabel noticed the prince seemed paler than usual. The seizures, frequent since his birth, had increased in recent weeks. The royal physicians had prescribed herbal ointments and prayers, but nothing seemed to improve his condition. "Your Highness, after eating Dr. Para, will come to examine you," she informed him gently, wiping the saliva that constantly escaped his lips. Charles nodded weakly. Despite his limitations, he showed some understanding and occasional flashes of intelligence that surprised his caretakers. However, his formal education was virtually non-existent. Royal tutors had tried to teach him to read and write, but his progress was painfully slow. In another wing of the palace, Queen Mariana met with her confessor, Father Neithard, and Don Juan José of Austria, the illegitimate son of the late King Philip IV, who pressed for a more active role in the regency. "Your Majesty, rumors about the prince's condition are spreading across Europe," Don Juan José reported. "Foreign ambassadors send detailed reports to their monarchs. France in particular watches our crown's weakness with interest." The queen, dressed in strict black, since her husband's death, maintained an impassive expression. "The prince is the legitimate heir anointed by God. His condition will improve with time," she replied, though she herself did not believe her words. "Your Majesty," Father Neithard interjected cautiously, "perhaps it would be prudent to consider an early marriage for His Highness. An heir would secure dynastic continuity and calm the court's unrest." The queen looked out the window toward the palace gardens. The idea of marrying off her son, who could barely fend for himself, seemed premature and cruel. Yet the political reality was unrelenting. Spain was losing territories, its power in Europe was waning, and the crown's legitimacy depended on dynastic continuity. "Charles is still a child," she replied finally. "When he turns 15, we will consider suitable candidates." What she did not mention was the question haunting the royal council. Would Charles ever be capable of producing an heir? The physicians attending him had serious doubts about his sexual development, and some even whispered that the prince might be sterile, a consequence of centuries of consanguinity. That afternoon, as Dr. Francisco de Parra examined Prince Charles, his concern was evident. The child had developed a new skin rash, and his seizures were becoming more frequent. "His Highness shows signs of exhaustion," he informed Isabel de Montoya. "We must increase the bleedings to balance his humors and intensify the prayers. The affliction is deep." What the physician dared not say aloud was that the prince's ailment was none other than the accumulation of centuries of consanguineous marriages. The characteristic Habsburg jaw, a prognathism barely noticeable in previous generations, had become a severe deformity in Charles. His family tree, rather than branching out like that of most people, closed in on itself alarmingly. Charles II was more consanguineous than if he had been the child of siblings. That night, as the prince slept restlessly in his bed surrounded by religious relics and amulets, Queen Mariana approached to watch him in the dim light of a few candles. She gazed at her son's face. Despite the deformity, she could see in him the features of her husband and Uncle Philip IV and those of her own father, Emperor Ferdinand. "My poor angel," she whispered gently, stroking his hair. "You bear the weight of us all." In that moment, as if responding to her voice, Charles opened his eyes and looked at his mother. For an instant, the queen saw in his gaze something that chilled her, a sudden lucidity, as if the child fully understood his fate and that of the dynasty he represented. "Mama," he said with difficulty, one of the few words he could pronounce clearly. The queen kissed his forehead and held back her tears. As a mother, she suffered for her son's condition. As a queen, she feared for the future of Spain and the Habsburg dynasty. What no one knew then was that Charles II would be the last of his line in Spain, and with him one of Europe's most powerful royal houses would come to an end. Madrid, November 1700. The royal Alcazar was shrouded in gloom, broken only by the flickering of hundreds of candles. In his royal chamber on a bed with a black velvet canopy lay Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg. At 39, his body, ravaged by illness, resembled that of an elderly man. His prominent lower jaw, the hallmark of his dynasty, taken to an extreme by consanguinity, made breathing a painful effort. Around the royal bed gathered physicians, priests, and nobles. Queen Mariana of Neuburg, his second wife, stood at a distance, aware that her position at court depended on the dying man who had never been able to give her a child. Cardinal Portocarrero leaned over the king holding a crucifix. "Your Majesty, it is time to prepare your soul to meet God," he murmured. With difficulty, Charles raised a trembling hand and grasped the crucifix. His life had been a succession of illnesses, painful treatments, and humiliations. Since his birth, he had been an object of pity, fear, and sometimes ridicule. The bewitched they called him behind his back, convinced that his physical and mental weakness could only be explained by witchcraft. The reality, far more mundane and tragic, was that Charles was the final result of generations of dynastic inbreeding. "Forgive me, Spain," he whispered, his deformed jaw making articulation difficult. "I have failed as a king." Cardinal Portocarrero exchanged glances with the Duke of Medina. Both knew that with Charles II's imminent death and no heirs, Spain faced a succession crisis that would likely lead to war. The great European powers, France, Austria, England, were already positioning their pieces on the geopolitical chessboard, anticipating the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. Charles II had signed his will weeks earlier, naming Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis the Return of France, as his successor. This decision, made after agonizing deliberations, aimed to preserve the territorial integrity of Spain and its empire, but meant the end of 2 centuries of Habsburg rule. "Your Majesty," his personal physician intervened, approaching with a potion. "This will ease your suffering." The king drank with difficulty. Throughout his life, he had been subjected to all manner of treatments, bleedings, purges, potions of liquid gold, pulverized human skulls, and even exorcisms when his seizures were interpreted as demonic possession. None had succeeded in strengthening his constitution, weakened since birth. As the night wore on, memories flooded Charles's mind, his overprotected childhood raised exclusively by women until age 10. His limited education unable to read or write properly until well into adolescence. His 2 childless marriages, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans and then to Mariana of Neuburg. The public humiliations during royal audiences when his weakness was evident to foreign ambassadors, who later wrote detailed reports about the diminished King of Spain. But above all, he recalled the moments of lucidity when he fully understood his situation and that of Spain. Contrary to popular belief, Charles II was not mentally incapable. His intelligence, though hampered by his poor education and physical limitations, allowed him to grasp the tragedy of his existence, being the last link in a glorious but doomed dynastic chain, condemned by its own matrimonial practices. "Water," he requested weakly. A page approached with a bohemian crystal glass. Charles drank with difficulty, the liquid escaping from the corners of his lips. His jaw was so prominent and his palate so deformed that even basic functions, like eating or drinking, were a challenge. As dawn approached, the king's breathing grew more labored. The physicians exchanged grim looks. There were no more treatments to offer. The medicine of the time had exhausted its limited arsenal against the monarch's numerous ailments. "Open the windows," Charles ordered, surprisingly with more strength than he had shown in days. "I want to see Madrid one last time." The servants obeyed, drawing back the heavy curtains. The cold November air entered the room, along with the pale light of the dawn beginning to break on the horizon. Charles II gazed at the sky, brightening over his capital. In that final moment of clarity, he understood that his death would mark not only the end of his personal suffering, but also the definitive decline of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and the beginning of a new era under the French Bourbon. "The dynasty dies with me," he murmured, "but Spain will live." At 5:15 a.m. on November 1st, 1700, Charles II, King of Spain, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, Duke of Milan, sovereign of the Netherlands and the Indies, exhaled his last breath. With him, the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg, victim of its own matrimonial policies that sought to preserve power and territories, was extinguished. As Madrid's bells began to toll announcing the king's death, European chancelleries dusted off maps and mobilized armies. The War of the Spanish Succession was about to begin. The body of Charles II, that royal infant born malformed 40 years earlier, was embalmed and dressed in royal finery for public display. His face, with the characteristic Habsburg jaw taken to a pathological extreme, was the last image the Spanish people had of a dynasty that had ruled their empire for nearly 2 centuries. In history books, Charles II would be remembered as the bewitched, a weak monarch under whose reign Spain lost power and influence. But for modern geneticists, he represents a case study in the devastating effects of extreme inbreeding. His coefficient of consanguinity was 0.2144, equivalent to that of a child of siblings, though in his case it was the result of generations of marriages between close relatives. The story of Charles II is not one of spells or curses, but a human and dynastic tragedy caused by the relentless science of genetics, unknown in his time, but evident in every labored breath, every seizure, every failed attempt to produce an heir to continue a family line destined to die out. The Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," revealed its fatal contradiction in the end. The same matrimonial alliances that had built their empire ultimately destroyed it.